My favorite group. You guys are this group is notorious for being good. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the National Park Service. My name is Dana. Any questions at all at any time? I love questions. It just shows me that you're involved and interested. I've been doing this for this will be my 7th year of doing this, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. It's a wonderful, wonderful tour. I think one of the great sites of American history here. Not just African American history, but American history. And that's the way we like to look at it here, as part of American history, not something that's separate. And I think one of the things that's interesting about this site in particular is the fact that most people come to Boston to learn about the political revolution that took place here in 1776. You know, the Paul Reveres and the John Adams and the Sam Adams. But I don't think many people realize that Boston is also the birthplace of America's social revolution. In other words, for those things that they professed and talked about in 1776 about equality for all, did that really mean all? Or did that just really mean wealthy white male property owners? And so that battle was waged here and fought here. And there's a direct connection between the two, which we'll get into a little bit later. But what you really have here is a social revolution. And a social revolution was centered up into the community we're going to be going up on the north slope of Beacon Hill. A free black community, which was something that was pretty special, pretty unique at that time. You're talking about a time prior to the Civil War of probably maybe 250,000 to 500,000 free African Americans total in the entire country, while there's about 4 million slaves. And up here, about 2,000, about 3% of Boston's population. But what a 3% they were. Absolutely amazing. Now, social revolutions, I believe, tend to really kind of come in two forms. One form of fighting a social revolution is by example. In other words, you live a life that's so exemplary and so in such contradiction to the prejudices held about you that it's hard for people to maintain those prejudices. You live a life of success, financial success, educational success, cultural development. You change the laws. You set an example of morality and dignity. And believe me, these folks up here are doing that in the late 1700s, living that life, changing the laws, working the system. And I think for us to kind of a historical perspective on that might be, much in the way that Martin Luther King fought for for the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, living by example. They're doing that up there in the 1780s and 90s. But another form of a social revolution, a different kind of course, is one that's more defiant. In other words, okay, enough. You can push us so far, but we're going to fight back. You got to shake society by its collar a little bit. You can't just run over us. You can't just push us around. And I think maybe in tune with Malcolm X and Nation of Islam in the 1960s, 50s, and 60s. Believe me, these folks are doing the same thing. Tough as nails when they had to be, particularly after the year 1850 with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed slave catchers to come up into these streets. So those are the two themes that I like to follow throughout the tour. So with that in mind, a perfect place to begin is with the Robert Gould Shaw Memorial. Okay, it commemorates the first all-black volunteer regiment to fight in the Civil War from the North. How many of you have seen the movie Glory? Good. Excellent film. I wouldn't change it for anything, but there were some significant differences with it. One is, in the movie, they tended to portray the key characters as ex-slaves and fugitive slaves, when in actuality, 4 out of 5 of these men, of a regiment of about 1,000 people, about 1,000 men, were actually born free, which was significant in the sense that many people at the time, the racism at the time, never believed that African Americans would fight for a higher cause other than themselves. So the fact that these were free men who volunteered to end this institution, I think is a statement in and of itself. It said and spoke volumes. Also, they weren't the first African Americans to fight in the Civil War. Others have been used by Union generals in the South, but kind of, I'm not sure if I want to use the word commandeered, but certainly it wasn't official. This was the first recognized regiment from the United States government. But it was a long time in coming. It was a difficult process. When the war first begins, Abraham Lincoln is not really concerned with abolitionism. How much of an abolitionist he really was in his heart, we really don't know. But certainly at the time, his main concern is to bring the South back into the fold, to preserve union. And kind of, this is kind of the last thing he wants to do if he's trying to bring the South back. Okay, come on, we'll let you keep your slaves, we just, bring back the Union. But the war goes so badly in the first couple of years that he begins to change his mind a little bit, and he starts listening to the folks right up here, particularly Massachusetts, the center of the abolitionist movement, as we'll see, who've been saying, hello, Abe, this has always been about racism, this is always about the institution of slavery and ending it. Let us prove that on the field of battle. And enter a man by the name of John A. Andrew, who is the governor. A very good man, a friend of Lincoln's, big kind of robust guy, true abolitionist, and he's the one who's pushing for it along with Frederick Douglass right up here. And Lincoln begins to listen because Lincoln needs two things at the time. One thing that he needs is manpower, okay? The war has gone so badly, it's lost on many, many fronts. He needs manpower, but probably more important, folks, is what he really needs is a moral core, a moral cause, something to inspire people to keep fighting more than just a more abstract concept of union. And so this is where this element comes in, and John Andrew steps forward. But Lincoln has one thing that he's afraid of. There were still 5 states of the Union fighting with the Confederacy, fighting on the Union side, who had slavery. And so Lincoln comes up with a pretty shrewd political move. And he was shrewd. It's called the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863, in which he frees the slaves, but only in the Confederate States, of which he has no jurisdiction. So many people say the Emancipation Proclamation didn't really immediately emancipate anybody, which is true, but it does open the door for this to happen. And the process begins. John Andrew takes the bull by the horns and begins the process. He goes down to Washington, D.C., and it's approved by Congress with one stipulation: white leadership. Okay, so John A. Andrew asks Robert Gould Shaw to do this, the man on horseback. Now, kind of scary how much he looks like Matthew Broderick, isn't it? A little bit creepy, but why him? Well, I felt in the movie that they kind of portrayed this assignment, or this giving of him the command as somewhat of a honorary kind of thing. Here you go, good and noble family. But I think there was more to it than that, and I always try to warn you when I'm giving you my personal opinion. But I really believe that John Andrew knew how special this man had to be. How he had to be a man who was so progressive in his thought that he would be able to rise above the racism of the time and understand not just the importance of this in terms of the war, but the importance of it to the history and the future of American race relations. He had to have somebody who would be able to bond with these men, love them as his men, see this more than just an assignment, and they in turn to bond with him. And the reason I feel that he saw that, John Andrew felt that, is because the person that he chose had such a progressive background. His, not only was his family, he was raised in a very special way. Not only was his family abolitionists, but they were also transcendentalists. The Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson crowd. Okay, and here's another one I love to tell. It's a little bit of a side note. Other Rangers kind of make fun of me for saying this one, but I want to let you know that to kind of give you an idea of how progressive they were, his parents have participated in America's first commune in 1841 in Brookfield, Massachusetts. Those hippies, look out. Just kidding. But isn't that wild? I mean, that really gives you an idea of how progressive their thinking was, and so that's, I think, why he asked him. Now, Shaw turns it down at first. I think he's a little overwhelmed by it. Why me? He's only 25 years old. He's currently serving in the state of Virginia. And he's also engaged to be married. But this is where his parents come in. His mother says, Bob, come on, Bob. This is God's will. This was meant to be. And so this is one of the things that turns him around, and he agrees to do it. And you know what? It was a great choice, and everything that Andrew had hoped for really does happen. Now, the regiment was made up of about 1,000 men from all over the northern states. And they trained just outside of Boston, a place called Reedville. And, Shaw trains them into a crack military unit. He had seen a lot of action himself. He'd been in the Shenandoah Valley campaign. He'd been at the Battle of Antietam, one of the bloodiest in history. So he knew what he was doing, and he trains them into a crack military unit. And in fact, when they are down south, they are known as the most professionally trained and best trained regiment in all of South Carolina at the time. Also, the thing that Andrew had hoped for, though, that bond, it did take place. In fact, there was a love that develops between the men and between their commander. And in fact, during the war, he will write to his mother and he says, Mom, these are the finest men I've ever had the opportunity to serve with. And so they're ready to go. Now, what the statue commemorates is their march around Boston in May of 1863. Now, a lot of people were concerned about how this might go. Especially city officials, they weren't quite sure how 1,000 black men with rifles in the street might be perceived by the white population at the time. And they placed police officers and constables in certain areas that they thought might be critical. But you know what, folks? The exact opposite happened to that. The outpouring of affection was magnificent, okay? Thousands of people lined these streets. And I'm not just throwing that number away. I want you to picture that. Thousands of people lining the streets of Boston, cheering for them and encouraging them. And I know it's kind of hard to picture, but they marched right behind us here, right down Beacon Street with all this traffic. It's kind of hard to picture. And the further along they went, the more inspired Robert Gould Shaw became. Now, as they pass right here, I think we can see, as they pass by, right up there at the door, that's where John Andrew and his entourage were standing. And included in that number was the great Frederick Douglass, right up there, right up there. His two sons were both serving in this regiment. And as he went by them, inspired as he was, he looks at them, he turns, and he takes a sword, and he salutes them with the sword. As he, looking them directly in the eye, salutes them with the sword as he goes by. It gets better. When they go by 44 Beacon Street, we don't go by there in the tour, but if you're around there later, that's where Robert Gould Shaw's sister lived. And the balconies are still there, folks. They're still there. And on those balconies is where his parents were, his sister was, his wife of only 3 weeks. He left a newlywed for this. And he goes by them, he does the same thing. Okay? He salutes him with a sword, but he does it one better. He looks him in the eyes, salutes him in the sword, and then puts the sword to his lips and kisses it. Man was developing a flair now, wasn't he? Was showing his love for the mission. They march around Boston Common down to the ships, and they sail down to South Carolina. And you know what's amazing? Their actions down there, and again, you probably remember this from the movie. They are challenged. Many people believe that they won't fight. They try to hurt them in several ways. But one of the things that amazes me about this, folks, is how can we be in the minds of a 19th century person, let alone a 19th century African American? And their actions, to me, I think are amazing in the sense of how modern their thinking was. Were they thinking of this social revolution? Were they thinking of how they were perceived? And I truly believe they were, based on their actions, because the first thing that happens is they try to pay them less money. They were promised combat wage when they were recruited. Shaw says these are combat soldiers, they will get combat wage. But when they get down there, they try to pay them workmen's wages. And Shaw protests, and the word comes back to Shaw, sorry, Bob, take it or leave it. And so now think about this, every man in the regiment, white officers and the soldiers themselves, refused to take a single cent until they were paid the full wage. What a temptation that would have been, money. These men are poor. They don't have money, and yet they refuse to take a single cent okay, until they're paid the full wage, knowing what it represented, demanding that they be recognized as men by the United States government, because, you know, that was the whole thing about them. You know, they were not perceived as men, children, animals, anything but men. Gets better. John A. Andrew offers to make up the difference, and again, they refuse to take a single cent. That I stand in awe of, and I think gives us a window into their souls, perhaps, as to how modern they really were, and what they saw, what they were doing. Okay, now they got it about a year or so later. Unfortunately, many of them were dead. But probably one of the first times, including this, that the black and white stood together for justice against the federal government in that kind of situation. Another thing they try to have them do is burn and raid Confederate homes. That's their assignment. Now, all of them are very much against this. Why? Because they understand that it plays right into the stereotypes about blacks, that they're animalistic, or that they have animal passions. You know, that was one of the justifications of slavery, that this controls the African animal instincts, right? Right? And so they realize it, and they refuse. And this time Shaw is able to win. He uses his influence, and it opens the door for, I think, one of the most important battles of the Civil War on a number of levels, as we'll see. It opens the door and gives them the opportunity to fight at a place called Fort Wagner, okay, which is in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, this is a very important fortress, folks. It was the key to controlling Charleston Harbor. Yeah, you know, so strategically it's important. Symbolically it's important. It was one of the keys to recapturing Fort Sumter, where the Civil War begun. Charleston had also been the center of the slave trade. So there's a lot going on there. But I'm telling you, folks, what's tough about it is it was a deadly, deadly mission. Okay, first of all, it was the largest earthworks fortress ever created in history. I've read that. It sat out on a narrow strip of land. Maybe you remember this from the movie. Okay, on a narrow strip of land. There's only one way to get it, which is right down the middle. On one side is ocean, the other side is swamp. There's only one way to get it, right down the middle. And they volunteer to lead the assault on this fortress. Heavily armed, several thousand soldiers inside. July 18th, 1863. Robert Gould Shaw gets off his horse and addresses his men. He says, "Men, I want you to prove yourselves. The eyes of thousands to look upon what you do here tonight." Ends up being more like the eyes of millions when it's all said and done. And he leads them a charge down the beach. They go through a saltwater moat up one of the first embankments. Robert Gould Shaw is shot through the chest and dies almost immediately. However, at the same time, the man carrying the American flag is also shot. And as he falls, a man in the regiment, a man by the name of Sergeant William Kearney, will catch the American flag as it falls from New Bedford, Massachusetts, catches the flag as it falls and puts it in his shirt, okay, to protect it. This is one American flag he does not want the Confederacy to capture. And they continue to fight. Now, against all odds, okay, the 54th Regiment breached the wall in two places at Fort Wagner, but eventually they are forced back. No armies will get any closer into Fort Wagner than the 54th. About a month or so later, eventually the fortress is abandoned because it's bombarded. So the fact that they breached the wall in two places is absolutely amazing. But they have to retreat. Kearney is still alive. Kearney cannot run. Kearney cannot walk. He's got 3 bullets in his body. So he is forced, folks, to crawl back to safety. Over a great distance, possibly as much as a mile, he crawls back to safety. Okay, however, when he gets there, he's surrounded by the survivors of the 54th Regiment, white officers included. He's able to stand. And at that point, he pulls the American flag out of his shirt. And he says, "I never let the dear old flag touch the ground, boys." For that, Sergeant William Kearney will become the first African American to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. Of course, it'll be 37 years later, you know. However, you know, again, my own interpretation, I can't be in the heads of Congress in the year 1900. But why? I mean, it's an incredible act, right? But I really believe in the big picture that it was very symbolic of how the nature of the Civil War changed. You know, I think prior to this, okay, you have two seemingly contradictory goals in the Civil War. One, the preservation of Union, and the other, the abolition of slavery. But here, these men who are not human by most standards, who are not even citizens, okay, considered property by the Supreme Court, are willing to fight and die, to sacrifice themselves to end this institution. I think that many people began to realize, like, oh my God, this slavery, this institution is always going to divide us. There'll always be people who will be willing to fight against it. And that maybe these two things really come together. That maybe the only way we could possibly have union is to abolish slavery. It's a cancer. It's a cancer on American society. Hey, we're involved in surgery here. Maybe we should just cut that cancer out and maybe, just maybe, heal as a union. So not only was there this ideological change, okay, I believe there was an actual a change in the physical nature of the Civil War. Because after the Battle of Fort Wagner, the volunteerism on the part of African Americans in the northern states to the Union Army was significant. Somewhere between 170 and 200,000 men, African Americans, volunteered for the Union Army. Now let's kind of put that in perspective, okay? You're talking about a time when, well, put it this way, the entire casualties, the number of casualties in the Civil War is 600,000. If you add 170,000 to 200,000 men towards in the last 2 years of the war to the Union Army, you get an idea of how significant, you know, the amount of manpower was. Probably somewhere in the neighborhood of a third of the Union Army was African American at the end of the war. Now, were you ever taught that? I was never taught that. Were you? Okay. So I think one of the myths out there in American history is that African Americans had nothing to do with really causing the Civil War, which we will totally show that to be false when we get up here, but also had very little to do with actually winning the war. A third of the Union Army. So that myth basically is dispelled. That's why we have historic sites like this, to really get a better view of what our history really, really was, you know? That's a mouthful. Now let's talk a little bit about the statue, because it is so worthy, folks, okay? Now the original idea for a monument came from the men themselves. The original idea came from the men themselves, and they wanted to place it at Fort Wagner, to the colonel. But it's a good thing they didn't do that, because to be underwater right now, okay? Very swampy area, all right? So the idea for this came in the 1880s, again from across the street. An African-American lawmaker, a man by the name of Joshua B. Smith, came up with the idea. Now, he's perfect for it. He's perfect because he'd known the Shaw family. He had known Robert Gould Shaw when he was a little boy, and he comes up with the idea. And the artist that they chose was a man by the name of Augustus St. Gaudens. Now, Augustus St. Gaudens was, again, an excellent choice, very progressive artist, known to mix allegory and realism, part of a cutting-edge, kind of a Renaissance period of public art in American history at the time, at the turn of the century, or just before the turn of the century. And he agrees to do it. Now he creates this entire monument in his studio in New York City, 148 West 36th Street, New York. Again, another thing the Rangers make fun of me for. But I want to know right where it was. And he creates it. Now the original idea was only to do Robert Gould Shaw on horseback. See, now at the time, you know, the benchmark of a great sculptor was how he did equestrian art. So he's very excited about doing it. But Shaw's parents find out about it, and they say, whoa, 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 wait a minute. No, don't glorify our son. It's about them. And so Augustus St. Gaudens planned to do the entire regiment. Now,